And welcome back to another edition, a live edition of the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. I'm your host, Sean Meyers, coming to you solo this week. Justin Lowry with other obligations, but we'll try my best to fill the big shoes left by Justin not being here. A lot of stuff to discuss this week as we are on the heels of the first ever WWE Stomping Grounds pay-per-view that took place on Sunday, a show that I was unable to watch live. If you watched the show last week, you know that I was away over the weekend, but did get caught up on it eventually. Also had to do some catching up to see Raw and Smackdown, but we're going to discuss those as well. I think a pretty good week of television for WWE, and I know saying that there's a lot of people who probably did not watch Stomping Grounds in its entirety, maybe aren't watching Raw and Smackdown on a regular basis. And that's understandable because the programming has really struggled for a while. But when you really break it down, if you individually evaluate this past week, the pay-per-view and the two shows, I think, positive reviews. So if you don't hold the prior shortcomings and failures against WWE, I think there was a lot of positives to take out of this week. But I want to start with the absolute biggest news. And before we get into that, I want to preface that if anyone is interested that's tuning in live right now, you can leave your comments. You can also ask questions. That's all in the chat there, and I will do my best to get to all that. But no surprise where we start today. The news came out, about 3 or 4 hours ago at this point, early Thursday afternoon here in the Pittsburgh area, that the two people who will be running Raw and SmackDown in upcoming months will be none other than the former ECW owner Paul Heyman and the man who ran WCW for years, Eric Bischoff. And this is pretty stunning, to be completely honest. Did not anticipate seeing Eric Bischoff whatsoever in a role like this. And Paul Heyman, he's a guy that incredibly talented, but didn't necessarily seem to be a guy that was of the same ilk of Vince McMahon in terms of their ideas of presenting professional wrestling. So I'm a little surprised that Vince gave power to basically his two former competitors. But this has created a lot of optimism, and I know at least briefly through text message, Justin Lowry expressed that as well. He said, well, all of a sudden I am now very interested in what WWE will look like going forward. I agree with that. That being said, I'm going to be honest. I think ultimately this could be a negative if it's not handled correctly by Vince McMahon. And when I say that, I love Paul Heyman. I think he's a wrestling genius in terms of his creativity. What he did with ECW was just top notch. He took a low budget promotion that had no reputation and turned it into an underground sensation. He really sparked the change that eventually trickled to WWE and WCW during the Monday Night Wars. Eric Bischoff, of course, a great businessman. He was very innovative in his own right. Although all the positives you could say about Eric Bischoff with WCW, you could probably come up with just as many negatives during his time there. You hope that he's learned from that. You hope that Paul Heyman has also learned. But ultimately, as good as these guys might be in these roles, and I'm way more confident that Paul Heyman will be good running Monday Night Raw as opposed to Bischoff in charge of SmackDown Live, how much will Vince McMahon allow them to make the decisions? Because we've always heard, the writers come up with these storylines and they really work hard, long-term booking, and then Vince just throws it out at the drop of a hat. Or maybe Vince agrees to something and then the next week he's bored with it and it's forgotten about. Will Vince really give autonomy to these two, or will it be Vince McMahon ultimately doing whatever he wants, and then if it fails, blaming Eric Bischoff and Paul Heyman as sort of fallmen for all this? That's a real possibility, and ultimately, it's something that, I hope that they get a real opportunity to turn things around, to bring their own blend to sports entertainment. And if that's the case, I think we could see pretty significant changes. People have been hoping and praying that Vince would do something to bring about changes. We'll see what happens. But again, if you're someone who's saying Vince McMahon needs to, loosen the grips, he needs to kind of delegate a little bit more, this could be a potential for that to happen. So stay tuned. Did not get exact clarification on when exactly this will take effect. Of course, Eric Bischoff will be working directly with Fox, but that's not till October, so that's still a few months away. I would be curious to see if he'll have a significant role before that time. And then same with Paul Heyman, who has been a higher up in some regards with WWE. He was a creative team member and a lead writer with SmackDown years ago. So he certainly has the background actually working behind the scenes in WWE, whereas Eric Bischoff, during his previous run with the company, he was just an on-screen character. He really had no say since basically WCW went down in early 2000. So that's the big story, and it's one that, yes, we introduce it today, but it's really probably going to take months and maybe even years to unfold to see how it really impacts the product each and every week on both Raw and SmackDown. I want to check the chat and see if anyone has joined us yet. At this point, again, feel free to chime in if you have any questions, any comments, anything you'd like us, or I should say me, since I'm flying solo, anything you would like me to discuss this week as we talk about the world of professional wrestling, not just WWE. We can delve to All Elite Wrestling, NXT, anything really you want to talk about, but general focus is WWE, and we're going to now shift to Stomping Grounds, the first ever pay-per-view, and it's, just a name change from what they've had in the past at this time of year. In the past, actually, June had been the Money in the Bank, but they moved that up this year, and thereabout came Stomping Grounds. I thought that while the build was not a good one because they spent so much time for the Super Showdown promotion that, basically you got a lot of rematches. Roman and Drew is a WrestleMania rematch, and then there was a couple rematches from Stomping Ground with the Universal and WWE title matches, and then a Money in the Bank rematch with Lacey Evans and Becky Lynch. It seems like it's a recurring theme. The promotion wasn't great. The storylines, the promos were lacking, and yet you get there Sunday night, the guys and gals deliver in the ring. We're going to go over our predictions, and I have some bragging to do about that, but let's kind of look at some of the biggest takeaways. Seth Rollins and Baron Corbin, the main event. This was one of the very few things that I did not really enjoy at Stomping Grounds. Basically, to me, it was just taking away the strength of Seth Rollins. And when you look at what Seth Rollins is great at, he is arguably the best in-ring guy in the company. And, there's certainly been a lot of back and forth with his tweets and Will Ospreay chiming in, saying things to the contrary. But you could argue Seth is as good as there is in WWE. And yet in this match, he couldn't really show that much of it because it was all about the, overbooking, if you will. It was about the storylines. As Baron Corbin had the opportunity to name the referee, and after Seth spent, a couple shows taking out all the potential male candidates, turns out to be Lacey Evans. And Lacey had a match earlier tonight against Seth's real-life girlfriend, Becky Lynch, so on and so forth. So really, it was just about, an overbooked story as opposed to a great in-ring competition. And I understand you do that every now and then. That's sort of been the trademark of WWE. But I think it's a disservice to Seth Rollins, who's the main event guy, because of how good he is in the ring, not because of the other aspects that he brings to the table. And, he's fine on the mic and characters, but it's more about his great in-ring work, and he wasn't able to show that. And Corbin's okay, but he's not a great worker at this point. He's certainly serviceable. So I guess, maybe realizing that it wasn't going to be a classic match, they kind of had to add that to it. I would have rather seen, a Seth Rollins versus, let's say, Sami Zayn, something like that, where they could just go out and tear the house down, because that's what Seth Rollins does best. That's what got Seth Rollins to a world championship. When you go back and just look at about a year ago at this time, there was no doubt he was the best in the ring each and every week on Raw, and pretty much every pay-per-view he was putting on incredible matches. That has sort of been curtailed a little bit going back to WrestleMania. It wasn't anything special at WrestleMania when he defeated Brock, and then since then, his matches, his one against AJ Styles was very good. I would say borderline great, but outside of that, did he have many memorable matches in the past 3 months? I would say not really. So this sort of followed suit there. The other title match, and by the way, obviously Seth won right decision. But unfortunately, we're going to get more Seth and Baron Corbin, as we'll get into. The other title match was in a cage, Kofi Kingston defending against Dolph, another rematch. But I think one that I was anticipating because I did not see the first matchup at Super Showdown, and I know these guys are just so darn good in the ring that I was interested in seeing them really do battle. What I thought was terrific was the ending to this match. And booking a cage match is difficult because in 2019, let's be honest, these guys are such athletes. They could scale the cage. They could run out the door in a matter of 3 seconds if they wanted to. You know, it's not these plodding 300-pound uncoordinated guys anymore. It's not a King Kong Bundy who probably would legitimately struggle to climb a cage. Kofi, incredible athlete. Dolph, a very good athlete. These guys could get out so easily that you have to really try to make it seem as though it's a struggle and that the match takes its toll and the guys are so slow to climb or so slow to crawl. Well, that led to the finish where Dolph was crawling out and it looked like he was going to get there, and then Kofi just leaped over him, and it was really an incredible visual, and Kofi put his body on the line to accomplish it. I thought that was terrific because it was a finish where Kofi won, but it wasn't as though he had dominated Dolph. He sort of just escaped with the victory, which he's still sort of playing up the underdog role, and I think that makes sense with him. So whether it be beating Kevin Owens or Dolph Ziggler, he's not going to be a dominant champ like a Roman Reigns or some of the other guys that we've seen, a Brock Lesnar. Certainly, he has to get it done in different ways, and this was another good example of it. I thought it was a good finish to the match, and something that as many cage matches as we have seen over the years, and I've been watching nearly 30 years, and there's multiple cage matches every year. This was the first time I had seen a finish really of this exact type. Now, we've seen things where guys have fallen off the cage or gone through the cage, but as far as jumping out over an opponent onto the floor with a pretty stiff landing, it was good. I liked it, and it worked for me, so I enjoyed that. I thought that, those, obviously the two world title matches are what really should be the biggest matches. I don't know that they necessarily were the best in terms of the in-ring stuff, but that's kind of what the pay-per-view is based on. So you look at the main event, Rollins and Corbin, to me that fell flat. Kofi and Dolph I thought was on the mark, and I really enjoyed that. But the match that I think I probably would rate as the best in terms of the in-ring competition didn't even make the main card. It was the pre-show triple threat for the Cruiserweight title, the 205 Live guys. Tony Nese defending against Drew Gulak and Akira Tozawa. This was spectacular, and I really love 205 Live, and I'm still trying to catch up. I had to take a break from it for quite some time for unrelated to the content, just being too far behind on some other stuff that I needed to kind of pick my priorities. 205 Live fell to the back of the line. So I'm still catching up. I'm still trying to finish out 2018, but I've always enjoyed the in-ring competition. I thought that it was a little underwhelming at Money in the Bank when Tony Nese defended against Arya Daivari, but this was some redemption for Nese. Even though he lost the title, just terrific match. One that all three of those guys can be proud of, and the crowd was really into it. Drew Gulak won, and that's fine because, it's not a major story who the champion is on 205 Live, as long as those guys still get an opportunity to deliver each and every week in the main event, and now seemingly most months at a pay-per-view, whether it be on the pre-show or not. Just good stuff, and they did a lot of creative spots that you see in triple threat matches that you can't typically get in a one-on-one. So major applause for those guys putting it all out there. Some of the other takeaways from the event, Bayley and Bliss was a pretty good match, and Bayley's a very talented in-ring competitor. Bliss is perfectly solid. Good to see that she's back healthy and was able to work a full match. Good, probably about as good of a match as you could hope for, but they sort of played with the Nikki Cross and Bliss dissension, or just their relationship at this point. I think that's going to be an interesting story to have unfold over the next couple of months. And then Nikki Cross sort of redeemed herself on SmackDown. She won a match against Bayley to get Bliss a rematch. So that'll continue, and ultimately we all know it's going to lead to Bliss and Nikki Cross going against one another eventually. But to get to that point, it should be a fun ride. Bayley needs to hang on to that title for a while and make it somewhat significant, because that title really lost importance on SmackDown, especially when Asuka won it and was sort of like disappeared from the show for a while, and then she lost to Charlotte, and then Charlotte threw it into the match at WrestleMania. She lost to Becky Lynch, who is really more so a Raw star. So I think Bayley needs a nice run. So good to see her get that victory. Becky and Lacey disappointed me, and I think Lacey Evans is a really good character. I could see why Vince likes her, but in ring wise, I think she's shaky and very inconsistent. She had a brutal match against Charlotte on Raw a handful of weeks ago, and then her and Becky just didn't seem like they were on the same page. That to me was probably the biggest disappointment of a match, because they had an opportunity. It wasn't something that was super overbooked like the main event, but really the show started, in terms of the main show, started and ended poorly. Everything in between was, I thought, very enjoyable. And that includes some tag team matches. The New Day, which is now Woods and E. They, as always, put on a tremendous match as they went against KO and Sammy. And then, of course, the SmackDown title match. Daniel Bryan, the home state boy, got a great ovation. He and Rowan were the faces, at least based on the crowd reaction, against Heavy Machinery. That was a good match, all things considered. And so when you look at the matches, and we'll take a look at our predictions, I think Ricochet beating Samoa Joe, that was a nice little surprise. Let's take a look at how our predictions panned out. And if Justin was here, I would certainly be rubbing in his face. I went 9 of 9, and as long as I've been doing the predictions, whether it be with Sean Saputo or Justin Lowry, this is the first time that anyone has gotten all of the matches correct. Justin still had above 500. He went 5 and 4, but all the matches that he picked different than I was able to get correct. And there's two ways to look at that. Either I got awfully lucky, or it was a very predictable show in terms of the outcomes. I would say that I sort of went out a little bit on a limb to pick Ricochet, as well as picking Drew Gulak. I thought that Bayley over Bliss was pretty obvious, and I was surprised that Justin went with Bliss. But if you heard his explanation, he just thought there was going to be a title change, so that was the one that he picked. I went with Ricochet winning for the title change, and that one turned out to be the correct one. Predictable, maybe, but ultimately I thought it was an enjoyable show. You'd still like to see more momentum heading into it, with better storyline development, but ultimately, as usually is the case, the roster delivered, which was good to see. Let's take a look now at Raw and SmackDown this week, because after a good show, we'd be curious to see where they went from there. And on Raw, I think there were some notable things, and some that I liked, some that I was not too fond of. The one that most people were talking about, and it's not necessarily for the right reasons, but The Undertaker made his return, and he's now involved with Roman Reigns against Shane McMahon and Drew McIntyre. I had heard speculation about this, but it just seems so unnecessary, and I know that this is an attempt to try to get the big name, to get some ratings back, to generate some interest, and I still feel like Vince McMahon is trying to do everything he can to help Roman Reigns get a face reaction. And he's, we put him with The Undertaker, fans are going to have to cheer. Here's the thing. The Undertaker is coming in off of probably what I think we can agree is the low point of his entire career in WWE, dating back to 1990. His match with Goldberg was dreadful. There was no doubt that The Undertaker wasn't happy about that match. I don't think Goldberg was happy. I'm sure that the people behind the scenes couldn't have been happy with the reaction it got online. Most fans justifiably bashed it. It's, it's, I think, almost a situation of they wanted to get Taker back out there to get that bad taste out of the fans' mouths, because had he been off TV until, let's say, SummerSlam, or maybe the next time they do a show in Saudi Arabia, or maybe the first SmackDown in October that goes on Fox, it would have, stuck with him and stuck with the fans, like, oh man, Taker, just was so bad in that last match. I hope he's done. Well, now they bring him back, and it's kind of a team that loses a blowout game. They want to get back on the field as soon as possible. Taker has a chance. He'll be teaming up with Roman against Shane and Drew. Could this be a train wreck match in itself? Yes, because Shane McMahon, solid, but he's not an everyday in-ring competitor, never has been. He kind of just does what he can, which a lot of times is some high spots, and he'll take bumps. And I think he'll probably take some bumps from The Undertaker. But He's not a guy you can count on for a great match. And Roman and Drew are very good, but are they going to be good enough to kind of mask potential shortcomings for Shane and The Undertaker? I don't know. They're going to have to make sure that they try to book this match correctly, protect those guys when it comes up at Extreme Rules in a couple of weeks. But Undertaker's back, for better or worse. I would be completely fine not seeing The Undertaker for quite some time. And at this point, you know, I keep wrestling with what is going to be the correct way for him to have his final match. Because we all thought, and Justin agrees, he lost to Roman Reigns at WrestleMania. He put the hat down in the ring. That should have been it. Well, it's not it. So is he going to go out on his own terms? Is he going to go out gracefully? Is he going to have a real send-off? Or is he kind of just going to go to the point where his body won't allow him to wrestle another match? You never know. I certainly do not anticipate that Extreme Rules, of all things, will be his final match against Shane McMahon and Drew McIntyre. But you never know. So The Undertaker is back. We'll see if it really creates much of an influx in terms of increased ratings. But the problem is more time given to guys like Undertaker and Goldberg, less time given to, you know, the very talented, in their prime guys who deserve the spotlight each and every week. One of those guys that does seem to be breaking through, however, is Ricochet. We mentioned he won the Intercontinental title, or excuse me, the U.S. title from Samoa Joe at Stomping Grounds while he was in the main event of Raw. He went against AJ Styles, a dream match, and that's what people have wanted to see Ricochet doing, stuff like working against AJ Styles. Main event of Raw, did it really mean a lot? Not necessarily. Would they maybe have been better off to save it for a pay-per-view for the first meeting between those two? You could argue that, but at this point, they really can't hold back and say, well, we'll just coast to a pay-per-view, because they do something like that, all of a sudden people aren't watching the pay-per-view if they're not interested in Raw or SmackDown. So you kind of have to bring out some bigger matches, and especially because it was the main event, you know, starting at about 10:35, typically ratings drop at that point anyway. So really it seemed like the Undertaker's appearance was the true main event of Raw. Ricochet and Styles was just the last match, if you will. But AJ won. Good showing for Ricochet. I think it's going to help him. And I'll be curious to see what they do with AJ Styles going forward, because AJ, while winning that match, it's sort of tied in with another storyline, and that is of AJ Styles sort of prodding Anderson and Gallows, his longtime pals. Of course, they were together as part of the club. Now it's AJ's the single star. Anderson and Gallows have been languishing as a tag team, and he's been saying, hey, you guys are better than this. Come on. Go out and prove how good you are, how good you used to be. You were the stars in New Japan, best tag team in the world. Now you're a joke. Well, they went out and had a match earlier in the night in which they lost to the Viking Raiders, and while they had a more aggressive side at times, ultimately they were not able to get the victory. So when you see Anderson and Gallows finally being in a storyline, we're like, hey, that's a positive. These guys weren't doing anything for months on end. I mean, not even appearing on TV, let alone being in significant storylines. Now they're in one with AJ Styles. So they lost. You see AJ like, oh, you know, come on, guys. And then they came out during AJ's match with Ricochet. And there's two reasons for that. One, because they want to progress that storyline of them sort of, you know, trying to be heels while AJ's being the face. And we'll see how that dynamic plays out. But the other reason they came out is because they had to find a reason to break up the match flow heading into a commercial. And if you watched the show last week, I will toot my horn a little bit here. I sort of, to an extent, broke the news that the new strategy will be Raw and SmackDown. You're not going to get matches that span a commercial break. So you're not going to get a match that starts, goes through a commercial break, continues on the other side. They are doing these 2 out of 3 falls. They're doing elimination matches so that there is a clear stoppage before they head into the commercial break. Come back 2.5, 3 minutes later, the match resumes at that point. And they've made that abundantly clear with the announcer saying we will restart the match. Here's the thing. In this case, they did, I guess, somewhat of a creative way, because Anderson and Gallows try to interfere, and then AJ's like, get out of here. And then it's like, well, they're going to leave during a commercial break, and then the match will basically resume. Why they needed to wait that entire commercial break, logically, yeah, it doesn't make sense. We know that. But that's the reason why they're doing it. But how long can you get by doing, like, just completely illogical 2 out of 3 falls matches or elimination matches? And then in doing stuff like that, you kind of give away, like, okay, if it's a 2 out of 3 falls match, we know there's going to be a fall right before the commercial break, and then a pause, and then they'll continue and probably do falls number 2 and potentially falls number 3 after they come back and prior to the next commercial break. So does it really make it better? I think it makes it worse. I know that analytically it said, like, okay, they lose some viewers when the fans feel like they're missing what's happening during a commercial break. Just have a better show, and that's not going to be an issue. I mean, this is how wrestling has worked for decades at this point. So why are they trying to reinvent the wheel here and make it really awkward in how they have to always have something that happens? You throw really logic completely out the window in doing this, because let's say there's a 2 out of 3 falls match. The fall that happens right before the commercial break, they stop for like 3 minutes. But if there's a fall that happens early in a segment, they go right into the next fall. They don't take that 2 to 3 minute break on camera. So what's the justification behind that? Of course there's not. We're just supposed to, whatever, suspend our belief. And then Justin and I brought up the point, the fans in attendance, it sucks for them. One reason you go to a show is to see what you miss when the commercials are running, when the cameras are off, if you will. You're not seeing anything now if you're there in attendance. So it's probably going to maybe hurt live attendance a small amount. Is it going to help TV ratings a significant amount? I would say absolutely not. So probably something short term that won't ultimately last. Nonetheless, that was an interesting way of doing that with the AJ and Ricochet match, because they wanted to give those guys time. But of course, if you're going to span 2 segments with their new mentality, you have to figure out a way to break up the action somehow, and that's how they went about it. Also on Raw, a new challenger seemingly for the WWE Champion Kofi Kingston and Samoa Joe. And all about Samoa Joe challenging for a title. Love that idea. However, it comes as a Raw guy is challenging the SmackDown champion. So, wild card rule. No one's keeping track anymore of how many Raw superstars appear on SmackDown. Yes, it's supposed to be 4, but it's like as many as they want, vice versa. But much like Bliss going after Bayley, I just don't like the idea of someone on Raw going after a SmackDown title. There's one thing to have a person appear for a cameo on another show and wrestle, but for them to be a title contender for another show, why isn't Samoa Joe going after the Universal title that's on Raw with Seth Rollins? I know that's because they don't want him to. They need a new challenger for Kofi, but it just doesn't make sense. And while I'm looking forward to Joe and Kofi, I would really prefer if they avoided having the cross-promotion or inter-promotion, whatever you want to call it, title feuds. It's silly to me. That being said, Samoa Joe, I think, is absolutely going to kill it in this feud against Kofi. I'm looking forward to it. And we know it's going to seemingly be a one-on-one match because main event of SmackDown, Kofi against Dolph. If Dolph won, he was in. It was a triple threat. Dolph did not win, so it's Kofi and Joe one-on-one to kind of round things out. Just about set to wrap this up as we're nearing about a half an hour, but I did want to throw it out there. If anyone is watching and any questions that they might have, feel free to chime in now, because I love hearing from our audience, whether it be comments, questions, anything they want us to discuss. Always like to interact with the people and get some good conversation on Twitter. Again, if you're interested in following us on Twitter, it is 5-Star Pod Wrestle. Also, you can check us out on Instagram, 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. And, of course, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Should be down below. Press the subscribe button so that you can get notified when we do live shows like this. And this certainly, hopefully, will not be the last one. I know it was lagging a little bit when Justin and I were together, but it seems like running a lot more smoothly today solo. So maybe that'll be the game plan going forward. But not seeing anything, any conversation right now in the chat. So do want to say, if anyone is interested in reaching out to us, contacting us, feel free to do it on Instagram, do it on Twitter. You can leave comments on the video as well after the fact if you go back and watch it. Subscribe to the channel. We always appreciate new listeners and new viewers as we continue to try to grow the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. Well, let's put a bow on this one. Again, big news. Eric Bischoff, Paul Heyman, they will be in charge of Raw and Smackdown, with Bischoff guiding SmackDown. Again, we'll see if that happens once they move to Fox or maybe before so. Paul Heyman running Raw. Will Vince McMahon allow them to have full power? I would suggest no, but we'll see. If Vince is serious about trying to change for the better, maybe he will. Stomping Grounds, pretty good, not great. I think the main event prevented it from being a great show, but in-ring wise, solid, and that's usually what you get from WWE superstars that get a chance to go out there and put on good matches. They usually do. Storyline wise, I wasn't huge on the show, but I think some good things certainly happened. It carried over into a decent week of Raw and SmackDown. Not happy to see a near 60-year-old Undertaker back, but some of the other stuff that happened, guy like Ricochet getting a main event match against AJ Styles, a real storyline it seems like now that we've seen it on back-to-back weeks for Anderson and Gallows. Samoa Joe getting another world title feud, much deserved for him, as seemingly he has moved on and above the U.S. title that he held. We saw some development on SmackDown. Also, real quick, Shinsuke Nakamura looks like he could be feuding with Finn Balor for the IC title. Aleister Black, apparently he's finally going to find out who his first challenger is, as someone knocked on the door as his little vignette signed off. So really good stuff. Before we call it a show, I do want to bring back a segment that we introduced last week, Ways to Improve WWE. And Justin and I will continue to each and every week give our suggestion, a very simple idea for how WWE can improve its product. This week I want to talk about using backstage promos, sit-down interviews, and vignettes as a way to really connect the audience with the superstars. You see it often in NXT. You'd seen it in generations past. In WWE, a new superstar's coming. They have vignettes promoting who this person is, why we should care about them. Or even someone who's been on the main roster. Have them have a sit-down interview and really delve into their character and what we should know about them. What makes them more than just a guy who goes out there and wrestles. NXT has done a great job, and the example, and there's been so many, but the example that sticks out to me is Roderick Strong. He came to NXT, a very accomplished in-ring guy. No one would ever doubt his in-ring ability, but why would fans care about Roderick Strong? He's not a big personality. He doesn't have a great character, no catchphrases, very generic looking, if you will. So why would fans care about Roderick Strong other than saying, oh, he's a great wrestler? Well, they gave you 2 consecutive weeks of, a video package about his life, his tough upbringing, and the issues that his parents had, how wrestling was an escape for him. All of a sudden, the fans there in the Full Sail Arena, and probably the fans at home, certainly myself included in that group, they started to have more of a reason to care about Roderick Strong. And I think the fans rallied behind him. He got much more of a face reaction. Now, of course, this was years ago. They've moved on. He's Undisputed Era, so on and so forth. But little stuff like that should be seen more often on WWE programming as a way to have fans really invest and care about some of these great talents. Because just being a dominant in-ring performer or a tactician usually isn't enough to really get the fans behind you. So, Apollo Crews is a guy that really struggles to break through. Do something like this with Apollo Crews. I know he's a dad to at least one small child. I think he actually might have 2 kids. Touch on that maybe. Or his tough upbringing. I think he's, he has heritage in the continent of Africa. Maybe discuss that. He was formerly Uhan Nation. They did a little bit of this in NXT, but it kind of disappeared, and he's just a guy on the main roster. And I'm just using him as an example. There could be dozens of people that this would apply to, but give fans a reason to care with a full-length sit-down interview with the person, or these vignettes, or these video packages. All of a sudden, and by the way, they are doing this right now with Ali, and I think it's really good, and I'm interested to see what they do with him. I think they'll give him sort of a renewed push. Yeah, do it with Ali, But you could do it with a bunch of guys. Maybe not all simultaneously, pick your spots, but stuff like that needs to be seen more often on WWE's main shows, Raw and Smackdown, to really connect the fans and have them care about some of these great, talented superstars. That's going to do it for this edition, the live edition of the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. Of course, check us out on Twitter, 5-Star Pod Wrestle, Instagram, 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Press the subscribe button down below. Check out all the old videos. And, of course, we'll see you again next week right here on the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling.